Chapter 1. Mud on the Stone. The living room was so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a slow accusation. Maigret stood motionless, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the floor near the side door where a thin smear of mud had clung to the polished stone. He bent down, his index finger brushing the wetness, not the mud from the garden. This was the sandy clay that marked the path leading to the abandoned shed in the backyard. The housekeeper, Madame Léonie, had testified that the side door had not been opened during the afternoon of the murder, but the mud had dried only a few hours earlier. Maigret said nothing, but rose and walked silently to the window. Outside, the bare branches of the trees shook gently in the cold late winter wind. Mrs. Léonie, his voice boomed steadily. I want you to recount every minute of that afternoon. The housekeeper hesitated, her thin hands clasped together. Behind her glasses, her eyes wavered as if searching for a way out. In that moment, Maigret understood that he was dealing with more than just a murder, but a family that was keeping a secret big enough for them all to keep quiet. And that secret, he instinctively knew, was starting to leak through small cracks, like this streak of mud. He pulled his pipe from his pocket and slowly lit it. Pale blue smoke curled up, mingling with the thick air of the room. Madame Léonie, this mud stain. He pointed to the stone floor. It couldn't have appeared by itself. So who came in through the side door? The housekeeper swallowed. Outside in the hallway, a door closed softly. The creak of its hinges signaling that someone was listening. Maigret turned his head toward the sound, and a thin smile appeared on his lips. The game of cat and mouse had begun. Chapter 2. Footsteps in the hallway. The creak of the hinges had not yet ceased when Maigret emerged from the drawing room. The long, old carpeted hallway ended at a dark wooden staircase. The smell of damp wood and old tobacco smoke hung in the air. He saw no one, but the feeling of a gaze that had just left him was still fresh in his memory. What are you looking for? A man's voice rang out from the top of the stairs. It was Fernand, the family's nephew, tall and thin. His dark brown eyes narrowed as if assessing Maigret's every reaction. I am looking for the truth, Maigret replied without raising his head, his voice as light as cigarette smoke. It seems that in this house, everyone values silence more than light. Fernand shrugged, his lips curling into an unfriendly smile. "Here, Inspector, everyone knows what should be said and what shouldn't." Maigret took another step and stood opposite Fernand. "And what happened at the side door? That mud, can't it talk?" Fernand's eyes wavered for a moment, a reaction that was too quick for Maigret to miss. The young man turned slightly, throwing back a sentence. "Perhaps you should ask my uncle. He prefers to go to the warehouse than sit in the house." Fernand walked on, his footsteps creaking on the wooden floor like a countdown in Maigret's head. He turned back to the hallway and looked through the glass door into the backyard. The warehouse loomed, its mottled brick walls and gray-tiled roof like a forgotten memory. Smoke curled from his pipe again. Maigret knew that to get to the truth, he would have to delve into the dark places the family had tried to bury, and the barn would be the place to start. Chapter 3: Warehouse and Shadow. The warehouse door was ajar, its rusty hinges creaking as Maigret pushed it open. Inside, the smell of old engine oil mingled with the musty smell of torn sacks. Light filtered through a few cracks in the wall, casting long, swaying streaks in the wind. He stood still for a few seconds, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. On the ground, in addition to the muddy trail he had seen from the side door, there was a faint slide as if something heavy had been dragged inside. "Is anyone here?" his voice echoed, not loud, but enough to fill the cold space. There was no reply, only the sound of water dripping from somewhere, regular as the second hand of a dead clock. Maigret moved further, his shoes grinding against the splintered wood. He bent down and picked up a small piece of gray cloth, which felt damp to the touch and smelled pungently like antiseptic. A faint noise came from a dark corner. Maigret turned his head just in time to see a figure appear and disappear behind a pile of wooden crates. He walked quickly, but there was only a gap and a small door that opened into the alley behind the house. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, the wind carrying a chill and the smell of coal smoke. In the last light of day, Maigret caught a glimpse of a tall, thin figure disappearing around the corner. He didn't chase after them. Instead, he went back into the shed and lit another cigarette. The pieces began to appear, but someone was still trying to arrange them into a fake picture. Maigret knew that the game had just begun. Chapter 4: The Unwilling Witness. The air in the Decaux living room was thick. The smell of old wood and cigarette smoke lingered in the closed space. The man sitting opposite Maigret looked uncomfortable, his eyes constantly glancing towards the window as if afraid someone was eavesdropping. "You know why I am here," Maigret said, his voice even and slow. "Not to hear the memorized answers you have prepared." The witness, Louis Deschaux, swallowed. He was an accountant for the shipping company where the victim had worked. His face was pale, his dry, thin hands rubbing together as if seeking warmth. "I told the local police everything," he replied, but his voice trembled on the word everything. Maigret leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette. The smoke drifted slowly, swirling gently in the air, like the speed he wanted to impose. And what about the warehouse behind the dock? Who was that shadow I saw? And why was a piece of cloth covered with antiseptic lying there? Louis fidgeted, his eyes blinking rapidly. I don't know. Maybe the porters." Maigret smiled slightly, not in confidence, but in recognition of the fragility of the defense. "Monsieur Louis, the only thing I can be sure of is that you know more than you dare to say. And if you keep quiet, you may be found tomorrow in the same condition as the victim." The words hung in the air. Louis clenched his fists and looked down at the floor. Outside, the wind whistled through the windows, carrying the sound of a train whistle away. "There is someone," he whispered. "But if I tell, I might as well sign my own death warrant." Maigret flicked out his cigarette, his eyes darkening. The game had not just begun. It had just become more dangerous. Chapter 5: The Name in the Dark. Louis Deschaux leaned forward, his voice almost inaudible. "That man is called Voran." Maigret did not respond immediately. He let the name hang in the air, like the smoke curling around the ceiling. "Which Voran?" he asked slowly, his eyes fixed on Louis's pale face. "Nobody calls him by his real name, just Voran. He works on the sidelines, deals with off-the-books deals. Anyone who gets involved with him gets into trouble." Louis paused, swallowed, then lowered his voice even further. "The victim before he died, had a secret meeting with him in a bar near the old station. Maigret jotted down a few notes in his notebook, but his mind was racing ahead, picturing Voron's face, or at least the shadow he had heard about. "Do you have any proof?" Louis shook his head, then stood abruptly and walked to the window outside. A truck stopped for longer than usual. "They've been watching me," he whispered, "since this morning. If you leave, they'll think I've talked too much. And then—" Louis gripped the window frame, his eyes panicked. Maigret stood up and walked up behind him. He looked out. The truck had started and was slowly turning into the alley. A cold feeling crept through his coat. "Monsieur Louis," Maigret said, "from now on, you are no longer a free witness. You will come with me to the headquarters, and believe me, there, at least, you will survive the night." Louis turned around, as if relieved of a burden, but with another fear. As for Maigret, he knew well the name Voron was only the tip of a huge iceberg, and he was about to dive under. Chapter 6. The Tavern, near the old station. The pub, Le Puits Noir, was located next to the abandoned railway tracks, where the street lights barely revealed the cracks in the moss-covered walls. Maigret stood outside the door for a few seconds, lighting a cigarette, letting the smoke quietly blend into the night mist. Inside, the blaring music of an old radio drowned out the incoherent words of a few drunken customers. He entered, his dark coat fluttering in the wind. The bar was almost empty, except for a man sitting in a corner, his back to the door, wearing a fedora that covered most of his neck. The owner, thin, deep-eyed man, glanced at Maigret and went on cleaning his glass, as if he were just a casual visitor. Maigret chose a table diagonally opposite the man, just enough to see him through the wall mirror. He had broad shoulders, and his large hand clutched a glass of wine, but did not drink. Strangely enough, none of the other guests dared to sit near him. "Whiskey," Maigret called, his voice calm. He let time pass, waiting for the other party to notice his presence. About 10 minutes later, the man picked up his glass, drained it, and turned slowly. His eyes met Maigret's in the mirror, cold, searching, and unsurprised. "You were looking for me." His voice was hoarse, tinged with sarcasm. Maigret turned and leaned back in his chair, If you are Vorin, then yes, he laughed, but the laughter did not reach his eyes. They say I bring trouble. What about you, Inspector? Are you looking for trouble, or do you want to leave here in one piece? Maigret tapped his fingers lightly on the table, each tap deepening the space between them. I seek the truth. Whether I am whole or not depends on how you answer. Vorin put down his glass and stood slowly. He smelled of cheap tobacco and brandy as he leaned closer to Maigret. There are some things it's easier to die than to know. Then he left, the door slamming shut, leaving a cold void. Maigret remained seated, his eyes fixed on the whiskey that had not yet touched his lips. He knew that the game had just begun, and from now on, every step could be the last. Chapter 7. The Midnight Trap. Maigret left the Le Puits Noir just after midnight. The road leading to the hotel was deserted. The only sound was his footsteps, the wind rustling the old signs. A feeling of indifference ran down his spine, not cold, but instinctive alertness. He stopped, glanced quickly into the darkness behind him. No one. But Maigret knew that this absolute silence was a signal someone was watching. The turnoff led to the abandoned warehouses near the old station. The streetlights were broken, and only a thin, silvery moonlight fell on the uneven tiles. As Maigret stepped inside, a faint sound came from above, like the clanging of metal. Before he could react, the iron door behind him slammed shut. A man's voice rang out in the darkness. "You did not listen to my advice, Inspector." From the shadows, two men stepped out. One was tall and thin, carrying a wooden stick. The other was short and stocky, with a hooked nose, carrying a coil of rope. The smell of mold and engine oil mixed together, making the air thick. Maigret kept his voice low. "If this is the way you want to talk, I'm afraid it won't last." The tall, thin man smirked and stepped closer. "You think you have any bargaining power?" Suddenly, headlights from outside shone in, interrupting the drama. In that dazzling moment, Maigret caught a glimpse of a figure in the second-floor window. A large figure, a tilted fedora Vorin. He did not come down to help, but stood watching, as if gauging Maigret's reaction. The wooden stick swept across. Maigret ducked, then stepped back against the wall. Pulling the lighter from his pocket, A small spark erupted, enough for him to see the empty petrol can in the corner. He chuckled. "Are you sure you want to stay here?" The two men paused. Voran had disappeared from the window, but Maigret knew he was still around. And this trap was only the opening greeting. Chapter 8. Traces under the dust. When the headlights went out, the two men lost their advantage. They hesitated for a moment, then retreated, disappearing into dark corners like rats in their holes. Maigret stood still, listening to their fading footsteps, but they were no longer in his mind. What he cared about was Voran, who had appeared and disappeared. The fact that he was not directly involved meant that he wanted to keep his hands clean, or that he was hiding something more important. Maigret walked slowly towards the wall where Voran had stood. The ground was covered with a thick layer of dust. The imprint of a shoe sole was clearly marked with an expensive leather sole, not the kind worn by the dockers. He bent down, touched the print with his finger, and sniffed a familiar smell. Cuban cigars. In the corner of the wall, a rotten board had a small gap. Maigret pushed it aside with the tip of his shoe, revealing a thin wooden box covered in oilcloth. He opened it, and inside was a stack of old documents, a few faded photos, and a small brass key engraved with the number 37. The first photograph stopped him. Voran standing next to a blonde woman with razor-sharp eyes. Handwritten on the edge of the photo was the inscription, "Before everything changed. F." A creaking sound above made Maigret look up. A figure passed by. Not Voran this time, but a woman. And for a moment he recognized the face as the one in the photograph, but older, more tired. She disappeared down the iron staircase, her footsteps echoing. Maigret tucked the keys and the photos into his pocket and hurried after her. He knew that key number 37 would open not only a door, but also a secret that had been buried for too long. Chapter 9. Riverside Hotel. A drizzle began to fall as Maigret reached the street. The river was dark at night, reflecting the yellow lights, which shattered like broken glass. The woman's footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, quick but unhurried, as if she knew someone was following her but did not want to appear panicked. Maigret kept his distance. He let the sound of rain and distant engines mask his footsteps. She turned into a narrow street where an old wooden sign hung swaying. Hotel du Port. Room 2 francs, 1 night. The hotel was only 2 stories high, with a yellowed facade and dusty glass doors. The woman disappeared inside, the door closing so quietly that Maigret had to strain to hear it. He entered. The hall was dark, save for a wooden counter with a small bell. A gaunt old man, his eyes dirty, looked up from an old newspaper. Room 37, Maigret asked, his voice low but clear. The counterman paused for a moment, then narrowed his eyes. Second floor, end of the hall, but the key is up there. Maigret smiled slightly. It's okay. I have the key. He climbed the narrow stairs, the wood creaking under his feet. At the end of the hall, door number 37 appeared, its paint peeling, its lock dull. The brass key fit perfectly, turning with a light click. Inside, the small, cramped room smelled of dampness and old powder. On the wooden table by the window was a half-open suitcase, revealing several thick envelopes and a leather-bound notebook. Maigret had just stepped forward when he heard footsteps stop in the hallway. He closed the door, the yellow light bulb casting its shadow on the wall. The door opened. The blonde woman walked in, her eyes not surprised, but as if she had been waiting for him. Are you looking for me? Or for the truth? She asked, her voice hoarse and slow. Outside, the sound of the river lapping at the banks was intense. Maigret knew that from here the story would take a completely different turn, where the secrets of Veron and this woman would weave together into a much more dangerous web than he had imagined. Chapter 10. The leather-bound notebook. Maigret did not answer the woman's question at once. He walked over to the table, gently closed the suitcase, and picked up the leather-bound book. The leather was worn, and the corners were curled as if it had been dipped in water. The woman stood still, but her sharp eyes followed his every move. If you're going to read, at least pour me a drink, she said, walking over to the small table where the amber bottle of wine stood. Maigret nodded slightly, poured 2 glasses, one for her, one for himself. He opened the notebook. The first page was not a diary or a simple note, but a list of names with dates and huge sums of money. Many of the names were familiar: merchants, bankers, even some officials. The notes beside them were short, but suggestive of ambiguity. Foreign, river warehouse, CL, customs, AB, night transport. What do you do? Maigret asked, his voice low but not questioning, just like an evening conversation. She sipped her wine, her lips slightly curled. I arranged it. People pay to make things work. Voren was my guest too, until he forgot to pay a huge sum. Maigret turned to the last page. A line was scribbled in haste. The ink still smudged 14th, last delivery. If it fails, everything sinks. He looked up. The 14th is tomorrow. She nodded. You get the idea. If I disappeared before then, someone would try to cover their tracks, even with blood outside. The train whistle echoed across the river, long and cold. Maigret sensed that this was more than a murder. It was a chain of secret dealings, and tomorrow would be the final link, or the beginning of a new tragedy. Chapter 11. The river wharf at midnight. Maigret did not leave the riverside quarter all afternoon. He stopped by an old cafe where sailors congregated, sat at a table in the corner, smoked his pipe, and listened to anecdotes about undocumented shipments. These fragments gradually pieced together a picture of a smuggling network, discreet but imperfect. And in all the stories, the name Varin appeared sporadically, like a big fish that had never been caught. As night fell, a damp mist rose from the river, thick as a white curtain. Maigret walked slowly towards dock number 7, where the leather-bound book contained the simple words, "Routine delivery." The steady hum of a ship's engine echoed in the distance. Headlights swept through the mist, revealing the silhouettes of wooden crates stacked high, marked with faded red paint. A group of men in dark coats stood around, talking briefly and curtly. Maigret hid behind a package and watched. He recognized a familiar face, a port policeman who had previously been suspected of taking bribes. The man spoke briefly to a man in a long overcoat and a low hat. From his coat pocket, he pulled a thick envelope and silently thrust it into the other man's hand. A faint sound came from behind him, the creaking of wood. Maigret turned, but the darkness swallowed everything. When he turned back, the group had begun loading the boat. He took out his notebook and quickly wrote down the ship's number and the names of the people loading the cargo. Then, from the head of the dock, hurried footsteps and a low shout rang out. "Quick, someone is following." The flashlight was aimed at Maigret. He was forced to retreat into the mist, through the piles of goods, his heart pounding, but his step steady. Behind him, the motorboat roared, leaving the riverbank in silence and the pungent smell of oil smoke. Maigret knows that following this shipment will lead him straight into the heart of a web of power and betrayal, where every mistake is paid for in blood. Chapter 12. The warehouse behind the distillery. The next morning, Maigret returned to Pier 7. The traces of the night's shipment were almost gone. The loading dock was deserted, save for a few muddy tracks leading to the small road leading to the suburbs. He followed the tracks of the wheels through the damp warehouses until the pungent smell of brandy mixed with the smell of rotting wood led him to an old building, the Pommier Distillery, which had been closed for more than a year. The side door was ajar. From inside came the sound of metal clanging and hushed voices. Maigret leaned in and peered through the crack. 3 men were loading identical wooden crates to the ones from last night into a bunker, concealed under a concrete floor with a wooden lid. One of them turned around, and Maigret recognized Henri Vaurent, a face that had appeared in the files of previous years in connection with arms smuggling. What caught his attention more was the man standing next to Vaurent. It was the same port policeman he had seen at the dock, now posing as a protector of the loading and unloading operations. Maigret stepped back silently, but his foot struck a broken glass bottle. The sharp sound of breaking tore through the air. From inside, a shout rang out. "Who is it?" The door swung open. A burly man rushed out, but Maigret had already turned into the alley, lost in the pile of empty barrels and wood dust. The footsteps followed him, but then stopped. He turned back, perhaps not wanting to make a fuss and attract passers-by. Maigret made his way around the corner to a small cafe overlooking the distillery. He sat down, ordered a Calvados, and watched from behind the frosted glass. The crates would surely leave before dark, and he would know where they were going. He smiled faintly. This time, the game would no longer be cat and mouse. It would be the cat blocking the cave. Chapter 13. The Woman in the Red Riding Hood. The afternoon was falling quickly. the mist from the river filling the air with a musty smell. Maigret was still sitting in the cafe, the Calvados in front of him cold. He didn't drink it, just used it as an excuse to stay longer, his eyes never leaving the door beside the winery. At about 6 o'clock, a silver-gray truck stopped by the wall. 3 men came out carrying wooden crates and loaded them into the truck. At that moment, a woman appeared. She wore a brown coat and a red scarf around her neck, and walked briskly but calculatingly. Maigret recognized her at once. Léonie Martel, the widow of a notorious wine merchant who had disappeared from Paris after a mysterious warehouse fire. Léonie said a few words to Varenne, then opened her wallet and handed him a thick envelope. Money, for sure. Léonie's face was cold, but her eyes kept darting towards the main road, as if afraid that someone was watching. Maigret knew that this was not just an ordinary shipment, but a link to finding the ringleader. He left the cafe quietly and circled around the back street where the truck would pass. From the darkness, Maigret struck a match and lit his pipe, the flame illuminating his pensive face. He would let the truck go, but follow it from a distance, every turn, every block, until it led him to the nest. As the car started moving, Léonie turned suddenly. For a moment, her eyes met Maigret's across a distance of more than 30 meters. Neither of them said anything, but Maigret knew. The game now had a dangerous player. Chapter 14. Compartment 17. The silver-gray truck rolled slowly, its red tail lights glowing on the wet pavement. Maigret walked quickly but kept his distance. His soft-soled leather shoes barely making a sound. He didn't need to look at the map. Instinct guided him through the deserted, labyrinthine streets. The car turned into a narrow alley where the street lights were obscured by old roofs. It stopped in front of a dingy brick building with a rotten wooden door bearing the number 17. The 2 porters unlocked the door and slid it aside. From inside, the smell of strong alcohol mixed with the musty smell of the stone cellar wafted out. But Maigret noticed something else. The smell of expensive foreign cigarettes, the kind only the rich and powerful smoked. He stopped at the entrance of the alley, pretending to light a cigarette, watching every movement. In the dim light, Maigret saw Varan come out, followed by Leonie Martel. But they were not alone. There were 4 other men, neatly dressed like middle-aged businessmen. They did not speak much, just exchanged envelopes and signed a leather-bound book. Suddenly, a noise came from the opposite direction. The basement door opened, revealing a room filled with tables, chairs, shipping maps, and accounting books. On the wall was a map of France, pinned with red pins and string. The network of illegal alcohol transportation stretched across the provinces. Maigret knew he had just found the heart of the line. As he was about to retreat, a figure broke away from the group and quickly walked towards the door. The light shone through, revealing his face, a high-ranking police officer whom Maigret had once encountered on a case, and who absolutely should not be here. A chill ran down Maigret's spine. The game was no longer about solving crimes. It was about surviving while knowing too much. Chapter 15. An invitation you can't refuse. Inspector Maigret. The voice behind him was warm and artificial, like honey, but there was a cold metal in it. Maigret turned slowly. The senior police officer, Commissaire Duval, stepped forward, his eyes shining under the brim of his hat. "Why come so far? Why don't you come in and have a drink with us without waiting for an answer?" He signaled. 2 porters immediately stepped out and stood like a wall on either side of Maigret. He did not respond, but adjusted his coat collar and exhaled a puff of smoke. "If you have invited me," Maigret's voice was even, "it would be impolite to refuse." Inside the cellar, a weak yellow light cast a shadow over the damp, mottled walls. The smell of strong alcohol and tobacco was heavy. In the center of the room was a long table covered with papers and envelopes, and a half-open safe, glinting with gold bars. Duval sat down at the head of the table, pointing to the chair opposite. "Please." Maigret sat down, his hands resting lightly on the table, his eyes scanning the area. Leonie Martel stood against the wall, her face tense. Varan poured wine, his hands shaking slightly. The other merchants were now completely silent, just looking at Maigret, as if assessing a prey that had just fallen into a trap. "You know, sometimes it's best to close your eyes," Duval said, his voice soft. "What you see here doesn't concern you unless you want it to. Maigret did not answer immediately. He took another cigarette and lit it. The light from the lighter reflected on his face, revealing wrinkles, but also something immovable. Stubbornness. "Do you think I came here alone?" Maigret said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. There was a heavy silence. Varin glanced at Duval, and Leonie swallowed. From outside, somewhere came the sound of a car engine, then the slam of a door. Someone was coming, and Duval suddenly understood. Maybe Maigret wasn't bluffing. Chapter 16. The fateful knock on the door. The sound of boots on the damp stairs silenced the cellar. All eyes turned to the door. Duval gestured to the two porters to approach Maigret, but he just sat there, taking another drag on his cigarette, his eyes fixed on the sound. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deep knocks, slow and steady like the heartbeat before a storm. Duval stood up, walked to the iron door, and opened it a crack. The light from the hallway shone in, accompanied by the shadow of a tall man in a raincoat. "Who are you?" Duval asked, his voice calm, but his eyes already showing concern. The outsider spoke in a hoarse voice. "Delivery from Quai de la Tournelle." Varin was startled. Quai de la Tournelle was more than just a dock. It was a secret code in the smuggling world, used only when he wanted to send urgent messages to his comrades. But this guy wasn't part of any gang. Duval hesitated for a moment, then opened the door a crack. As the hinges creaked, the stranger pushed hard, bursting in with 2 other figures behind him. In the tunnel light, 3 faces were visible: Lucas, Janvier, and Torrance, 3 of Maigret's right-hand men. "Sorry to interrupt your party," Lucas said, his tone sarcastic, "but the old man here invited us." Duval stepped back, his face red, while the 2 porters were pinned down on the table by Janvier and Torrance. Varin stood frozen, and Leonie smiled slightly, a smile that was difficult to tell whether it was relief or calculation. Maigret stood up, flicked off his cigarette ash. "Now then, Commissaire Duval, we will talk in my way." The atmosphere in the cellar had changed. The odds had turned. But Maigret knew that this was only the beginning, and Duval was not the type to give up just because he had been caught. Chapter 17. The Backstab. Duval stood still for a few seconds, as if weighing each possibility. There was no fear in his eyes, only a coldness mixed with contempt. Then he chuckled, the sound echoing in the damp cellar, like the sound of metal rubbing against metal. "Do you think you've won, Maigret?" he asked slowly, his hands still resting in his coat pockets. Lucas took a half step forward, gun clearly in his hand. But Duval just curled his lips and pulled out a small steel whistle. Before anyone could react, he blew a long, sharp blast. The whistle seemed to tear the air apart. Immediately after, hurried footsteps could be heard from the hallway outside, followed by the sound of the iron door above opening. Cold air and the smell of cigarette smoke and gasoline rushed down. A group of 4 men appeared tall, in black overcoats, and clearly not police. They held not pistols, but iron rods and gleaming knives. "I told you." Duval raised his head. "This is not your home turf." The space became cramped. Lucas and Janvier changed positions to shield Maigret. Torrance pulled Léonie back into a corner. Voran wanted to run away, but Duval's icy gaze nailed him to the spot. Maigret did not draw his gun. He stared at Duval, his voice low. "You made the wrong move. Once I am here, it means the higher-ups know everything. You have no place to run." But Duval just shrugged, his eyes flashing dangerously. "Run? No, Maigret. I intend to stay and finish things here." Then he gave the signal. 4 men in black stepped down another step, clubs and knives clutched in their hands. The cellar smelled of sweat, tobacco, and something else blood about to spill. Maigret gently squeezed the cigarette between his fingers, feeling the heat creeping into his skin. In his mind, every retreat and attack appeared like a prearranged chessboard. This battle would not only decide Duval's fate. Chapter 18. Smoke and Steel. Footsteps on the cement floor echoed like a death drum. 4 men in black spread out, surrounding Maigret's group. The small cellar suddenly became a closed box, where every breath was filled with tension. Lucas crouched down, the gun still pointed down, but his finger ready to pull the trigger. Janvier glanced at Maigret. His eyes seemed to ask, "What are your orders?" But Maigret remained still, only taking a deep drag on his cigarette and then gently exhaling a thin white cloud of smoke, letting it curl up in the dim yellow light to Duval smiled like he had masterminded the game. You see, Maigret, this is no longer about cops and criminals. This is about survival. One of the four men lunged forward. The iron rod swung horizontally, steel flashing. Lucas spun, narrowing the gap, then drove the butt of his gun into the man's side. There was a dry clang of bone against metal, and the man doubled over but held on. At the same time, another man approached Janvier. The folding knife popped out, the blade flashing. Janvier took half a step back, then suddenly used his foot to kick the opponent's shin. The knife fell with a clatter, but the other man immediately grabbed Janvier by the collar and held him down. Maigret did not move. He let the struggle continue for a few seconds, long enough for his opponent to believe that he had the upper hand. Then he said, his voice like a cold knife cutting through, "If one of us dies here, Duval, there will be nothing outside to hold back the order to attack your entire line." Duval paused. Hesitance flashed in his eyes, a rare crack in his mask of confidence. He understood. If Maigret did not strike now, there was another ring out there, and the signal to attack was just waiting for a nod. But the moment was brief. Duval narrowed his eyes. Maybe, but if I cut off the head first, the rest will disperse. He gave another signal. The stick man, Lucas had knocked away, charged again. The clang of metal echoed in the air, thick with smoke and humidity. In a dark corner, Léonie quietly slid her hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers touched something cold and hard. The small key Torrance had given her when the chaos began. She glanced at Maigret. He didn't nod, didn't make a gesture, but his eyes were enough to tell her the time had come. Chapter 19. The way out in the dark. The clanking of metal was so soft that only Léonie could hear it. She crouched, pretending to back away from the fight, and turned the key in the rusted lock of the iron door against the wall behind her. A cold wind blew in through the crack, carrying with it the smell of dampness and freedom. Ahead, Lucas and Janvier were still fighting the two men in black. Gasps, banging. The screech of metal cut through the air. Maigret didn't miss a beat. He remained in the middle, moving just enough to keep Duval in sight, just enough to keep him from noticing what else was going on behind him. "You think you are clever, Duval," said Maigret, his voice as steady as the hum of a slow train engine. But those who trust too much in their chess positions often forget that pawns can also be dangerous. Duval smirked, but his eyes darted to the door. In that split second, Maigret had taken a half step forward, blocking Léonie's view, his shadow covering hers. The lock clicked. The door opened. A dark space beyond opened up, leading down a narrow, low-ceilinged, damp corridor, perhaps the way out to the back street, or down to the old factory storeroom. Léonie turned back. Maigret only nodded slightly, a nod that Lucas and Janvier did not see. But they understood when they heard him shout Lucas Janvier back off. The two suddenly broke free from the grip and retreated towards Maigret. Duval, sensing something was wrong, raised his hand and signaled his men to charge. But as they approached, Maigret turned on the small flashlight in his pocket and shone it directly into his opponent's eyes. That few seconds of blinding light was enough. Go, Maigret ordered. Lucas pushed Léonie into the corridor first, Janvier following closely. Maigret was at the back, backing up step by step, gun in hand, like a final barrier. The shouts and the footsteps of pursuit echoed behind. But the dark, winding passage made them sound like echoes of a nightmare. At the second bend, the dim blue light of an emergency exit flashed. Léonie rushed forward and pushed. The door swung open, and the night air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of port engine oil and the distant sound of a ship's whistle. They went out, but Maigret did not stop. He said softly, almost in a whisper, "This is only the first round, and we will choose where the last round will be played." Behind him, in the darkness of the cellar, Duval's voice was filled with anger. Chapter 20. Rain on the Harbor. The rain came suddenly, as if the sky had been torn open. Heavy drops of water fell like stones on the slippery cobblestones. The yellow street lights reflected in streaks of light. The sound of the waves crashing against the embankment mixed with the sound of the rain, creating a dense sound, making it difficult to distinguish between the heartbeat of the city and the heartbeat of the people hiding. Maigret stood under the awning of an abandoned warehouse, his hat pulled low, hiding most of his face. Before him stretched the port, its silhouettes merging with those of cranes and people. Lucas and Janvier were elsewhere, each hidden behind a stack of containers. Leonie sat huddled in a truck parked at the edge of the road, her eyes wide but not daring to breathe. "Are you sure he'll come?" Lucas's voice came softly over the intercom. Maigret replied curtly, "Certainly. He won't give up without covering his tracks himself." In the distance, the sound of an engine echoed, low and steady. Headlights cut through the rain, casting cold white rays. A pickup truck pulled up next to the storage room, where a sliding door was already ajar. Duval appeared, a dark cloak, hooded, but unable to conceal the steady gait of a man accustomed to living outside the law. He gave a signal. The two men opened the trunk. Inside were wooden safes, which looked like old goods. But Maigret knew that beneath the disguise were files, documents, and things that would incriminate not only Duval, but also the powerful people behind him. Maigret stepped out of the shadows, his voice loud enough to be heard over the rain. "Don't waste your energy, Duval. This tide won't go out again." He turned, his eyes flashing with recognition, not surprise, but calculation. His hand flicked, and the shot rang out, sharp. Lucas returned fire from the left, Janvier from the right. The sound echoed off the steel walls of the container. Duval retreated into the warehouse, dragging a crate behind him as a shield. Maigret did not immediately follow. He glanced around, then nodded. A figure emerged from behind the warehouse. The port investigation team had been lying in wait. Duval's escape route was blocked. By the time he realized it, it was too late. The dry click of handcuffs echoed through the rain, and Duval's face was white, not with fear, but with the knowledge that the game was over. Maigret stepped closer, speaking loud enough for him to hear. "You can erase some footprints on wet ground, Duval. But when it rains like this, the footprints will go deeper." He was silent. Only the rain continued to fall, blurring the line between darkness and light on the docks. Chapter 21. Ghosts Behind. Night had turned to dawn, but the rain had not let up. The police station smelled of tobacco, coffee, and damp papers. Maigret sat at his desk, smoking thoughtfully from his pipe, while Duval was locked in the interrogation room next door. On the desk was the file he had been waiting for months, yellowing pages, mixed with photographs and financial documents. Lucas stepped in, shaking the rain off his jacket. "Sir," he confessed, but only enough to cover a few people. "The real ones behind it still haven't shown up." Maigret curled his lips, as if he had expected it. "Duval is just the hand. The head is elsewhere." Janvier brought in a thick envelope and whispered, "Report from the port of Le Havre. There is a trace of an identical shipment. It left 3 weeks ago, but disappeared midway. On paper, it belongs to a shell company in Luxembourg." Maigret opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the numbers, the signatures, the seals. Each red mark was a shadow of power. Men who would never appear at the docks, who would never hold a gun, but who pulled all the strings. On the other side of the glass, Duval sat still, his eyes downcast, but his hands clenched. He knew he was struggling not between speaking or not, but between living and disappearing. The men behind him were cruel enough to turn him into a nameless corpse if the word got out. Maigret stood up and walked into the interrogation room. The sound of the rain outside mingled with the sound of the clock on the wall. He placed the file in front of Duval, opening it to the page with his signature next to another name, a name he knew would make him jump. Sure enough, Duval's eyes trembled slightly. "You have 2 choices," Maigret said, his voice calm. "One is to keep quiet and wait for them to find you before we can intervene. The other is to speak up and let me take you where even they can't find you." The room was dead silent. Outside, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating Duval's face. And Maigret knew one of the biggest secrets of the affair was about to come out of that mouth. Chapter 22. Testimony in the Dark. Duval was silent for so long that the clock on the wall became a heavy beat in Maigret's head. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows, as if urging him to speak. Finally, Duval lifted his eyes, his gaze both defiant and desperate. "They are unlike anyone you have ever encountered, Maigret," he whispered. "They are not mere smugglers or street criminals. They sit at banquet tables with ministers, sign papers in law offices, and turn people into corpses with a single phone call." Maigret did not take notes. He just stood there, looking straight at him, as if trying to pull each word from his mind. Duval swallowed. The Luxembourg Company was just a front. In reality, all the instructions came from a man we knew only by his code name Lecomte. No one met him except a few intermediaries. I only saw him once, in a room on the top floor of the Majestic Hotel. He knew everything, even when I thought I was in hiding. Maigret sat down and tapped his hand on the table. What if I asked how to find him? Duval smiled sarcastically, but there was fear in that smile. You didn't find him. He found you when he wanted you gone. Lucas, leaning against the doorframe, shifted slightly, his eyes signaling to Maigret that they were recording every word. But Maigret knew that this testimony was a double-edged sword. The deeper he went, the greater the danger, not only for him, but for the whole team. He leaned slightly toward Duval, his voice low. You just gave me a reason not to stop. Lightning flashed. Their shadows stretched across the cold wall. Outside, a black, unmarked car stopped at the corner, its headlights off. No one in the interrogation room knew that Lecomte had just received word Maigret was closer than ever. Chapter 23. The Trap at the Quai des Orfèvres. The next morning, the office on the Quai des Orfèvres was filled with the smell of cigarettes and the hum of typewriters. But the atmosphere was strange, as if everyone was waiting for something they couldn't name. Lucas entered, placing a black envelope without a postmark before Maigret. Maigret opened it. Inside was a photograph taken from a very close-up him leaving the cafe last night. Duval looming behind him. The only words printed in red on the back. Be careful what you dig up. Lecomte Lucas asked softly. Maigret did not reply, but stood silently and walked to the window. Across the street, a man in a gray raincoat was leaning against a lamppost, his cigarette burning brightly in the rain. When Maigret looked down, he tilted his head slightly, not in greeting, but in confirmation. I am watching you. The telephone rang, a man's voice, deep and clear. Did not introduce himself. Monsieur Maigret, I believe you received your present this morning. If you want Duval to live longer than this week, meet me tonight, alone. La Sirène. Old Port. Then the cold click. Lucas stepped forward, wary. It's a trap, sir. Maigret put on his cloak and smoked his pipe. but did not light it. A trap, of course. But if we do not enter, we shall never know how many fangs this beast has. Outside, Paris was covered in rain. Its yellow lights blurred like watching eyes. Somewhere near the port, a hand was arranging the pieces for a game Maigret could not refuse. Chapter 24. The Sirene. La Sirene nestles on the edge of the old port, its sign painted a faded green, its windows opaque like old eyes that have seen too many secrets. The scents of salt, rust, and brandy mingled, clinging to the thick air. As Maigret entered, the creak of the wooden door drew the eyes of everyone in the bar to him a brief moment, but enough for him to sense the tension beneath the silence. In the far corner sat a man alone, his hat pulled low over his face. Before him was a glass of cognac, untouched. No introduction was necessary. This was the middleman Maigret knew he would find. He nodded slightly, signaling him to sit down. Monsieur Maigret? His voice was hoarse and even, as if each syllable had been weighed. You seek answers, but every answer comes with a price. Maigret puffed lightly on his pipe, replying without haste. And what is the price this time? Back off. Let the Duval thing die. There are people higher up than you think, and they don't want the past to surface. He leaned forward. The further you go, the more fragile your life and the lives of a few people you don't want to lose will become. Outside the window, the train whistle sounded, long and drawn out like a warning. Maigret looked straight into his eyes and saw in them not a simple threat, but a strange regret, as if he himself were caught in a web from which he could not escape. You will have to choose soon, he continued, standing up and leaving his glass of cognac untouched. And remember, you are not just investigating a case. You are touching an empire. The door closed behind him, leaving Maigret with the smell of cigarettes, alcohol, and the feeling that the game had just changed. Chapter 25. Long shadow over the harbor. Maigret left La Sirene a few minutes later, walking heavily but not unhurriedly. It was already dark, and the sea breeze was blowing in his face, salty and cold. In the distance, the cranes stretched like giant black arms against the yellow-gray sky. He did not return to the hotel. Instead, He followed the narrow alley leading to the docks, keeping enough distance so as not to lose sight of them. The middleman walked quickly, weaving through the laughing groups of sailors and bar girls. He never looked back, as if he knew for sure that no one would dare follow him, or as if he was used to being followed and didn't care. It was the kind of confidence that comes only from those who believe that behind them is a force too great to be touched. Maigret saw him turn onto an old wooden gangway leading to a temporarily moored cargo ship. From the deck emerged a tall, thin figure, a woman, her long hair blown back by the wind, her black cloak clinging to her body. She handed him a thick envelope, their hands brushing just long enough to make it no longer a cold transaction. The look they exchanged, both intimate and wary, made Maigret realize at once this was not just a criminal enterprise, but an emotional one, a dangerous bond. He hid behind a crate, taking in every detail the name of the ship, the Étoile Noire, the scratched port sign, and the woman's brief laugh, a sound that sounded like a challenge. When they returned inside, Maigret knew he had touched a new branch of the case, a strand that ran from the old port to the opulent rooms of Paris, where power and evil sat at the same table. The wind grew stronger, carrying the smell of oil and rust. Maigret tightened his collar and took out his pipe, but did not light it. The game had indeed changed, and from now on, every step he took would be calculated like a game of chess, where one wrong move meant losing everything. Chapter 26. The Dark Web. Maigret returned to Paris by night train without telling anyone. He sat in the third-class compartment, his pipe unlit, looking out the window into the dense night. The landscape receded behind him as if the city were receding, but in fact, he was moving closer to the heart of an unknown power. As soon as he got off at Austerlitz, Maigret did not return to the Quai des Orfèvres. He went straight into a small café on the Rue de Charenton, where a white-haired man in steel-rimmed glasses was reading Le Petit Parisien. They did not shake hands. A slight nod was enough. "Is it a big deal again?" the man asked, without taking his eyes off the newspaper. "More than you think," Maigret replied. his voice low. I need a list of all the ships that have called at Le Havre and Cherbourg in the last 3 months, and some names have disappeared from the official records. The man folded the newspaper, leaving a small piece of paper on the table. You know how to contact me, but this time, be more careful. There are some names that if you mention them, the whole room will fall silent. Maigret put the note in his pocket and stepped out into the cold drizzle. Instead of returning home, he made his way to an old apartment in the 11th arrondissement, where the wooden door was faded and the landlord's nameplate was scratched off. There, a group of old friends, a few ex-cops, an investigative journalist, and a retired arms dealer were waiting. On the table in the middle of the room, a map of Paris and its ports was spread out, pinned with red, blue, and yellow pins at important points. Maigret placed the piece of paper on the table, his eyes moving from person to person. From now on, we will work as if we do not exist in anyone's records, he said. The person we are dealing with is not only good at covering up his tracks, but also at burying witnesses. Outside, the Seine's whistle echoed, long and deep, as if signaling a siege was beginning, but without any rules. Chapter 27. The Prey and the Trap. 3 days later, Paris was shrouded in a thick fog. The street lights in the 5th arrondissement were yellow and blurred, like halos trapped in frosted glass. Maigret stood in a wine shop near the Pont de Sully. A few drops of red wine left in his glass, but he had not yet drunk. His pipe was cold. He was waiting. The bait was a fake name Paul Delmas, an up-and-coming captain of the smuggling trade, willing to trade anything from spirits to weapons. Information about Paul Delmas had been accidentally leaked to people Maigret knew were part of the network he was hunting. Near midnight, a woman entered the bar. She wore a long navy blue coat, a silk scarf around her neck, her eyes as sharp as daggers. She approached Maigret's table and placed an envelope on it. No greeting. "Your man wants to see you," she said softly. "Tomorrow, 10 p.m. Dock for Grenelle, alone." Maigret nodded slightly, pretending to remember. But in fact, all the warning signals in his head were flashing at once. Alone, that meant the trap was set. As she left, Maigret signaled Lucas, who was playing the role of a drunk at the bar. to follow. But a few minutes later, Lucas returned, his face ashen. She disappeared like smoke, Lucas said, without a trace. The following night, Maigret arrived at Grenelle. Warehouse 4 was dark, except for the sound of the water lapping against the shore and the clanking of chains. He entered, his hand lightly touching the gun in his coat pocket. From the darkness, a man's voice called out, "You are not Paul Delmas." Suddenly, a bright light flashed on, blinding him. There were 3 men standing before him, each with a gun. But it wasn't the gun that stopped Maigret. It was the man sitting in the old wooden chair in the middle of the warehouse, a face he had thought had died 8 years ago. Chapter 28. The One Who Returned from Darkness. The man sitting in the middle of the warehouse smirked. Despite his graying hair, sunken eyes, and gaunt face, Maigret could not mistake him. Armand Lefebvre, a former undercover agent, former partner, and the man reported killed in a warehouse fire in Marseille. He is dead, Maigret said softly, his voice unable to hide his shock. Dead Armand laughed hoarsely. No, Jules, I only disappeared because you signed the order to abandon me. The 2 men standing beside Armand moved closer, the glint of their guns reflecting the cold steel. Maigret kept his eyes on the other man's face, trying to ignore the pounding of his heart. The Marseille affair, Armand continued. You think it was just a failed operation, no? Someone in the ranks betrayed us. I was arrested, interrogated, and when I got out, I realized one thing: the traitor was still free, still living peacefully in Paris. Maigret tilted his head slightly, slowly. And you think it was me? Armand did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled an old photograph from his pocket, the edges scorched. It showed a group of men from that year's campaign, and just behind it, in the dim corner, a strange figure was handing an envelope to an officer. It took me 8 years to track him down, Armand said, his voice low, and all the tracks led back to you. The silence in the warehouse was thick. Maigret felt as if he were standing on the brink, not of an ordinary case, but of a life and death game where all the pieces had been laid out in advance. From outside, the long whistle of a train echoed in. 3 men moved, forcing Maigret into the seat opposite Armand. We will talk, Armand said softly. and you will tell the truth. If not, you will disappear, this time forever. Chapter 29. Interrogation in the dark. The dull yellow light hanging from the ceiling of the warehouse flickered, casting long shadows of Maigret and Armand on the wall. The air smelled of mold and cigarette smoke. 4 men stood like statues on the outside, their hands ready to pull the trigger. Armand poured wine into 2 old glasses, pushing one toward Maigret. Drink. Let us talk like people who once trusted each other. Maigret did not touch his glass. He looked Armand straight in the eye. Are you looking for justice? Or are you looking for someone to blame? Armand's smile stiffened. He took a sip, then set the glass down on the wooden table with a soft but heavy clink. Justice, Jules. Justice hasn't fed me for 8 years. There is only one thing, the truth. And the truth is that someone set me up that night. He gestured. One of the men stepped forward and placed a thick file on the table, its edges smeared with dried blood. I kept everything: secret reports, maps, and even statements the official police never heard. Maigret opened the file. The first page contained photographs of the scene of the fire, a collapsed warehouse, its roof blazing, but in the corner of the photo, a figure in a dark raincoat was leaving, holding a black briefcase. Scrawled beneath the photo were the words, "Not local. Linked to Paris." It's you in the picture, Armand whispered, his eyes never leaving Maigret. No, Maigret replied, his voice calm but cold as steel. I wasn't there. And if you really believed I'd betrayed you, you wouldn't have spent 8 years coming to me. You would have shot me on sight. Armand narrowed his eyes. For a moment, the warehouse froze. Then he laughed hoarsely, but the laughter did not hide the tension. Perhaps you still have value. Perhaps you can lead me to the person who really sold us out. Suddenly, 3 metallic knocks came from outside the door. The signal. A junior rushed out, then turned back to whisper in Armand's ear. His expression changed immediately. Looks like we're running out of time. Jules, Armand said, standing up. There are others after you too. And believe me, they don't ask as many questions as I do. The truck engine roared outside the warehouse. Headlights swept through the cracks in the door, revealing dust particles floating like golden rain. Maigret understood that the interrogation had turned into a new game, one where both he and Armand could be prey. Chapter 30. The third person appears. The warehouse door flew open. A cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the strong smell of gasoline. 3 figures in long coats and hats pulled low over their faces poured in like a night wind. In their hands were short-barreled pistols that gleamed. Armand immediately drew his gun, but Maigret held out his hand to stop him, his eyes never leaving the newcomers. "Shooting now," Maigret said softly, "will only get us killed." The leader of the strange group took a step forward, his deep voice resounding in the dense space. "Mr. Maigret, Mr. Armand, we are not here to negotiate. We are here to take back what you are holding." Armand gritted his teeth. "Who are you?" The other man chuckled, pulling back the brim of his hat to reveal a face that had appeared in classified files. Vidal, a former spy who had disappeared from police records more than 4 years ago. "You know who I am, Armand, and you know what I want." He glanced down at the file that lay open on the table, the photo of the fire scene and the figure in the raincoat. "This photo," Vidal said, "does not just incriminate a traitor. It also reveals a list of people who signed our death warrant years ago." Maigret spoke, his voice slow, but loud enough to be heard over the wind outside. "If you take it, how many more people will die? Vidal, do you think you can end this bloodshed?" Vidal did not answer immediately. Instead, he signaled for a subordinate to come forward and take the file. Armand stopped him, the gun in his hand pointed straight at his chest. The air was thick, save for the metallic click of a finger on the trigger. Suddenly, from the back of the warehouse, there was the sound of breaking glass and hurried footsteps. A small, dark figure rushed in, throwing something on the floor. There was a flash of light, a smoke grenade. Thick gray smoke immediately enveloped everything. Shouting, crashing, and short gunshots rang out. Maigret coughed, trying to find his way through the chaotic maze. Through the smoke, he heard Armand's voice shouting, "Jules, keep the files. Don't let them disappear again." A hand suddenly grabbed his shoulder and pulled him toward the back door. Maigret didn't have time to see his face, only to hear a whisper close to his ear. "If you want to live, follow me." Chapter 31. The line between allies and enemies. Maigret was dragged out through the iron door at the back of the warehouse, the cold biting into his flesh. The night sky was thick with clouds, and a light rain was falling, mingling with the smell of smoke and gunpowder on his clothes. The man who had saved him wore a black cloth mask and moved quickly and decisively, like someone accustomed to the dark. Maigret jerked his arm, but the other man tightened his grip, forcing him to follow. "Who are you?" Maigret growled. There was no answer, just heavy breathing and the sound of footsteps on wet concrete. They turned into a dark alley, its dark brick walls mottled with moisture. Maigret felt as if each brick was closing in, swallowing him deeper into the maze of the port quarter. Finally, the stranger stopped under the rotting awning of a closed watch repair shop. The man removed his mask. In the dim yellow light, his face was thin, but his eyes were sharp as knives. "Inspector, you don't know me," he said softly, "but I know you. And I know that what happened in the warehouse was just the beginning. Vidal isn't the only one who wants that file." Maigret stared, trying to read the truth behind the words. "Why did you save me?" The stranger curled his lips, his smile mixed with bitterness. "Because I owe you a life. 10 years ago, you caught the man who killed my sister. If Vidal gets the file, your life will not be intact for me to repay the debt." Maigret crossed his arms, feeling the tension creep into his every breath. "Do you know where the file is?" The other nodded. "Armand still has it. But you must choose now. Trust me and find a way to escape from Vidal and the others, or go back alone and face it all." Maigret did not answer immediately. The distant whistle of a train echoed, lingering like a warning. To him, the figure of this man had the light of an ally and the darkness of a hidden predator. "You lead the way," he said softly, "but I will find out for myself which side you are on." The other turned away, and they plunged into the rainy night, where every turn could lead to salvation or death. Chapter 32. Rain on the harbor. The rain fell harder as Maigret and the stranger made their way down the damp alleys toward the docks. The yellow light from the few street lamps reflected off the puddles, creating spots of light that quivered as if breathing. The smell of salt mixed with the smell engine oil and rotten fish, covering the air in a thick gloom. The stranger walked ahead, walking quickly but unhurriedly, as if calculating every corner. Maigret followed quietly, his eyes scanning the area, taking in every detail: the cracked wooden doors, the silhouette of a person smoking under the eaves, the distant murmur of someone arguing. "Don't look too much," he said softly without turning his head. "In this place, curious eyes are an invitation to trouble." "And you," Maigret replied shortly, "are you inviting me into a trap or saving me?" The other person did not answer. Only the sound of rain tapping on the tin roof was an answer. They approached an abandoned warehouse, the large wooden door locked with an old chain. The stranger took a rusty key from his shirt, inserted it into the lock, and turned it gently. The door opened, the hinges creaking loudly like a warning. It was dark inside, save for a few slits of light from the broken roof. Fresh, wet boot prints led deeper into the ground. Maigret paused, his eyes narrowing. Someone got here before us. The other man noticed too. He pulled an old pistol from his belt and gave Maigret a brief nod. "You go left, I go right." Footsteps echoed through the warehouse, slow and deliberate. A deep, hoarse voice spoke from the darkness. "Maigret, you're here at last." From the darkness of the warehouse, a figure emerged and stepped into the dim light. His long coat was soaked with water. His eyes were cold. In his hand, a black briefcase. The briefcase Maigret had been looking for all this time. Chapter 33. The Briefcase and the Confession. Maigret stood still, feeling his heart beat steadily and slowly, the familiar rhythm that always accompanied his presence on the edge of life and death. The stranger beside him hunched his shoulders, his pistol held low but ready to be raised at any moment. The figure in front of him shook the briefcase gently. "Do you know what's in here?" he asked, his voice as if testing. Maigret did not answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the other man's cold, clammy hands. Not the briefcase, but the way he held it so carefully, so obsessively. "It's what killed 2 people and disappeared without a trace," Maigret replied, his voice low. "And I guess it's what's kept you awake all these years." He laughed dryly. The laughter echoed in the warehouse, mixing with the sound of the rain pounding on the roof. "Sleep well. I never wanted to sleep well. I wanted everyone to remember. To remember." that I never lost. The stranger tilted his head, looking at Maigret as if to ask with his eyes, "Is this the man you mentioned?" Maigret did not answer, only took a step forward. "You have everything sorted out," Maigret said slowly. "From the death of the girl in the square to the disappearance of the only witness. But you forgot one thing." "What?" He narrowed his eyes. "You yourself become a witness," Maigret replied, his voice cold as steel. "And witnesses can always be forced to speak." He smiled faintly, then suddenly threw the briefcase towards a dark corner. The sound of the collision was dry. At that moment, he pulled out a gun from his waist. Down the stranger roared. The gunshot rang out. A bullet hit the crate behind Maigret, sending splinters flying. The stranger reacted quickly, firing back, the bullet cutting through the air, sending the other staggering. The briefcase lay rolled over, the lock undone. Inside, not money, not documents, but a stack of old, yellowed photographs wrapped in oilcloth. Maigret bent down, his hand shaking slightly as he recognized the faces in the pictures, the dead, the ones whose case files never mentioned. He looked up, staring straight at the man clutching the wound in his shoulder, blood seeping crimson. "You just gave me a reason to reopen this whole case," Maigret said. Outside, police sirens sounded in the distance, getting closer. The rain still hadn't stopped. Chapter 34. The Photo and the Door to the Past. The interrogation room was bathed in cold white light. The clock on the wall ticked, ticked, as if measuring every breath of the person sitting opposite Maigret. He sat sideways in his chair, bandages wrapped around his shoulders, eyes glancing at the stack of photos on the table as if they were a nest of snakes ready to bite back. Maigret said nothing at once. He sat there, lighting a cigarette, letting the smoke drift slowly across the space between them. The stranger, who had now introduced himself as Lefebvre, an undercover Interpol agent, stood in the corner, arms folded, watching his every move. Maigret pulled out the first photo. A woman in a long dress, standing in front of the old building on the Rue de l'Hôpital. Her eyes were fearful and warning. "Who is she?" Maigret asked. The other man narrowed his eyes, then curled his lips. "One person is no longer relevant." "On the contrary," Maigret replied slowly. She is involved in everything. She is the only one who knows who really ordered the murder of the girl in the square. He was silent. Maigret moved on to the second photograph. A festive night. Fireworks were blazing in the sky. But in the corner, a hand was pulling a young boy into a dark alley. Lefebvre stepped forward and tapped the photograph. This boy disappeared in 1933. The case was never solved. Maigret looked at the interrogator. You don't keep these photos for blackmail. You keep them because they are raw wounds, and someone still wants to make sure they are never seen. His eyes changed. There was no longer the challenge. Only something Maigret had seen many times in his life. The weariness of someone who had carried a secret for too long. Finally, he sighed. You don't understand. This isn't just one case. This is a series. A system. These deaths are just the beginning. Maigret inclined his head slightly. So where do you begin? Outside. The police sirens had stopped. The air in the room was thick, waiting for the first answer. The answer that could open a door to the past that someone had locked for decades. Chapter 35. The longest confession beginning in 1941. His voice was hoarse, as if drawn from the bottom of a deep well. He looked not at Maigret or Lefebvre, but at the white wall, as if the story were engraved there. I was 18. I was just a delivery boy, but I heard things I shouldn't have. In a bar near the Gare Saint-Lazare. He paused, took a deep breath, then continued. The man at the top was a lawyer. No, a boss who knew the law. He hid everything under the guise of real estate deals. But in reality, he ran a network of informants, human traffickers, and witness killers. Lefebvre glanced at Maigret, but he remained silent, his hands tapping a steady rhythm on the table. The boy in the fireworks picture, he glanced, was the one I was ordered to take out of the city. But I knew if I did, he would never come back. I ran away, and from then on, I became a target. He chuckled, a bitter laugh. The pictures you found in my room weren't of me. They were sent as a reminder that they were still there, that at any moment I could disappear. Maigret leaned forward. You said they. Can you name them? He looked down at his hands. His knuckles were white from the tight grip. Some are dead. Some you see every day in court, in the city hall, even in the police. Lefebvre stirred slightly, but Maigret raised his hand for silence. I understand, Maigret said slowly, that from this moment on, if I don't say everything, I won't have another chance. He looked up, his eyes a mixture of fear and determination. I will, but we can't stay here. None of us are safe in this headquarters. In that moment, Maigret realized the case he thought was at its final stage was actually just beginning. Chapter 36. The Night of the Horloge. The rain was falling lightly, thin as a veil of smoke, as Maigret and Lefebvre led him down the back stairs where the street lights did not reach. Paris was still awake at night, but here, on the riverbank, there was only the sound of water lapping against the stone quay and the distant hum of a freighter's engine. Maigret, wearing a shabby hat, hunched his shoulders to blend in with the moving shadows of the stragglers looking for a place to sleep. Lefebvre followed, close enough to react if he tried to flee, far enough away to not attract attention. Where to? Lefebvre asked softly. The Pont Neuf. Maigret replied, There's a cafe that stays open late. Safer than headquarters, huh? He said nothing, just pulled up the collar of his coat. But his eyes kept glancing back. Not the look of someone about to run away, but of someone who knew something was following him. Through the steamy window of the cafe, Maigret saw the silhouette of a man standing under the awning opposite, smoking, motionless as a statue. Only the tiny red light from the tip of his cigarette occasionally flickered. A shiver ran down his spine. Inside the shop, the smell of strong coffee mixed with the smell of cigarette smoke. Maigret chose a secluded table near the toilet. With his back to the wall, he sat opposite, his hands still hidden in his coat pockets. Begin, said Maigret in a low voice. He nodded slightly. There was a case that never made the news. The body of a judge was found in a liquor store outside the city. They made it look like an accident, but I know who ordered it. The man you think is on our side. Maigret leaned forward. Do you have proof? He pulled out a small, rain-soaked memory stick and placed it on the table. It's got everything here. Names, deals, kill orders. But he paused. looking out the window. We don't have much time. Outside, the man with the cigarette had disappeared. Chapter 37. Hunting in the Rain. They left the cafe close to midnight. The riverside path was damp and cold, the pale yellow light reflecting off the puddles. Maigret tucked the memory card into an inside pocket. His hand clenched as if for dear life. Lefebvre walked close by, his eyes scanning the darkness. A car engine roared at the end of the street. "Hurry," Maigret ordered, pushing him ahead. From the alley on the left, a black Citroën sped out, its headlights illuminating the road like blades. A figure emerged from the passenger seat, something flashing silver in his hand. Not a knife, but a small pistol. Bang! The bullet shattered the glass of the antique shop next to them. The alarm bells blared, mixing with the sound of pouring rain. Maigret pressed him against the wall. Lefebvre drew his gun and counterattacked, but the car had already swerved into another alley, the tires screeching on the wet stone. The air smelled of gunpowder and cold metal. "They know," he gasped. "They won't stop until I'm dead." Maigret glanced at Lefebvre. His colleague's eyes understood. This was no longer a matter of escorting a witness. It was about protecting the only key to the entire crime network. They crossed the bridge and descended into the labyrinthine old town, where twisting alleys could swallow their pursuers or drive them into dead ends. Footsteps echoed behind them, steady and heavy. There were at least 2 people following, and they knew the terrain better. The rain was pouring down. The river was turbid and swirling. Maigret pushed open the door of a small tavern. Yellow light spilled out, and the strong smell of alcohol and tobacco filled the air. The tavern owner recognized him, didn't ask, just nodded slightly and pointed to the cellar door leading down to the wine cellar. "Here," Maigret whispered, "we will wait until morning." But as the cellar door closed, the footsteps stopped right in front of the inn. A deep voice said softly, "They're in here." Chapter 38. The basement with no exit. The air in the basement was thick with the scent of damp wood and old wine. Rows of wooden crates formed a maze of narrow passageways. The dim, yellow light from the ceiling light flickered as the wind blew through the vents. Maigret put his hand on Lefebvre's shoulder, signaling absolute silence. They could hear the creaking of the tavern door hinges above. Then the click of boots on the wooden floor. slowly, step by step. Where are you? The voice was low and hoarse, echoing like a curse. Lefebvre swallowed, his hand tightening on the gun. Maigret knew one sound, and they would be discovered. There was a click. Someone had locked the front door from the inside. There was no way back up the street. The footsteps split into two directions. One was descending the stairs. Another was around to the side hatch, which had only a flimsy iron bar. Maigret gently pulled Lefebvre between two rows of crates, deeper into the dark corner. His eyes scanned the objects: casks, wine racks, rotten wooden shelves, and then stopped on a large, dusty crate. In there, he gestured. They had barely hidden when the ceiling light went out. Darkness fell, leaving only the sound of pounding hearts and heavy breathing. Another voice rang out, so close that one could feel its breath. You think you can escape? A cold light flashed. A flashlight swept across the row of crates. It was coming toward them. Maigret silently placed his hand on his gun, his eyes fixed on the approaching footsteps. 1 second of mistake and everything would be over. Chapter 39. The decisive strike in the darkness. The footsteps drew nearer. The screech of leather on cement, sending a chill down the spine. The beam of light from the flashlight swept across the wine barrel, stopping just where Maigret and Lefebvre were hiding for what seemed an eternity. The light slid past and then returned, locking in place. Got it. The man's voice was filled with pleasure. Maigret didn't wait another beat. He swung his hips and kicked hard at the wooden crate in front of him. The sound of breaking wood echoed, and a series of wine bottles fell to the floor, shattering. The strong smell of red wine filled the air, and the flying glass made the man reflexively raise his hands to cover his face. Lefebvre immediately lunged forward, grabbed the wrist holding the flashlight, and twisted it. There was a dry crack, followed by a scream of pain. The flashlight fell and rolled, creating swirling streaks of light on the tunnel walls. But from the side hatch came the sound of metal breaking. The second man had unlocked it and stepped in, his shadow falling long on the wine-soaked tiles. In the flickering light, Maigret could see the steel glint of the long knife he held. Go out and live. Stay and die. He gritted his teeth. Maigret backed away, but only to lure him into deeper darkness. Waiting for the right moment, he swept his foot hard, sending him skidding across the stained wine. The knife flew out, sliding far into the corner. Lefebvre quickly kicked hard, pushing the knife out of reach. In a few chaotic seconds, Maigret had knocked them both down. Gasps echoed in the silent space, broken only by the dripping of wine and the clanging of metal. But when he turned the flashlight back on, what he saw was more than just two men tied up. On the tile floor, in a pool of dark red wine, stood a thick, blood-stained envelope. Scrawled on the outside were the words, "Too much to tell." Maigret frowned slightly. He knew the game had only just begun. Chapter 40. Blood Envelope. The flashlight shook in Lefebvre's hand, its yellow light illuminating the drops of wine and blood on the floor. Maigret bent down, his leather gloves dark with moisture. He lifted the envelope, the feeling of the cold wetness clinging to his skin, sending a shiver down his spine. The handwriting on the envelope was scribbled, but it was written in dark blue ink, with a heavy stroke, as if the writer were angry or desperate. Maigret opened it slowly, the small blade in his pocket cutting along the edge of the paper. Inside, there were not only papers, but also a small, heavy object, an old key, the handle engraved with the symbols M42. The accompanying letter contained only one line. "Whoever finds this will know a secret no one should know." Lefebvre frowned. "This key, do you recognize it?" Maigret nodded, but did not answer immediately. In his mind, the symbol M42 reminded him of a long-forgotten door in an old warehouse near the port, a center for smuggling alcohol during the war. Some old witnesses still said that some rooms there had never been opened since the double murders occurred 15 years ago. He put the envelope in his inside pocket, his voice low. "We have to go now, before someone realizes the key is gone." But as soon as he turned around, a whistling sound came from the ventilation system, followed by an unusually cold breeze. The flashlight beam swept across the wall, revealing a new line of words written in wet white paint. "You're too late." Lefebvre swallowed. "They are here, right now." Maigret did not reply. He knew that, from the moment he found the bloody envelope, every next step would be a chase with people who were not only good at hiding, but also knew his every thought.